Okay, welcome to the afternoon session of this workshop. So the next talk is the invited talk by James Bassett. James is a PhD student at UC Berkeley, supervised by Professor Sanjam Garg. He is working on various aspects of cryptography. In particular, he has amazing results on quantum secure computation and quantum obfuscation. Today, he is going to talk about how to provably delete information.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction and for inviting me here. So yeah, I'll be talking about this, which is mostly going to be based on a joint work I have with Dakshita Khurana. Okay, so in this talk, I'll start by just introducing the setting and thinking about, what kind of guarantees can we even hope for when we think about deleting information. And then I'll talk about the first part of our work, which is a generic compiler where we can add this notion of certified deletion to many cryptographic primitives. I'll continue by talking about the second part, which is this new notion that we have called everlasting security transfer. And finally, if there's time, it's okay if there's not, but I can tease some a follow-up work we also have with Sanjam Garg and Bhaskar Roberts. Okay. So the basic scenario, or one basic scenario that you might imagine, is you just have some data on your phone, and it gets uploaded to the cloud. Maybe just automatically, or you upload it to store it on the cloud. And let's say that before you upload it, you encode it in some manner. And later on, you realize that you decide for whatever reason that you no longer want the cloud to have that data, and you ask them to delete it, right? And so what we're going to be interested in is trying to come up with a protocol, basically, that allows the cloud to kind of delete your data and then send some information or a proof back to the client that certifies that they actually have done that they actually have deleted the data, right? So in this case, if you're kind of convinced by their proof, it should be the case that suddenly the cloud no longer has that data with them. And I guess the first thing to notice is that this is, if the encoding is classical, you're just using classical information to do that, then you can only hope for something very limited, which is security against kind of completely honest servers that will promise to never say copy your encoding and just keep a copy with them, right? And this has actually been a topic of recent study, at least formalizing what it means to have security against such honest servers, okay, in kind of the totally classical setting. But in this work and in this talk, we're going to be discussing a different problem, which is can we actually obtain security against potentially malicious servers, okay? And based on this discussion so far, it's pretty clear that we'll at least have to use something quantum. And if we encode our data into a quantum state that somehow can't be cloned, then we can hope to obtain this type of provable guarantees, right? If we at least block this trivial copying attack. The next thing to notice maybe is that, okay, it's so sure, the encoding itself might be unclonable, but we also need it to be the case that you can't just recover, the server can't just recover a classical description of your data from that encoding and then copy that, right? So we'll need our encoding to somehow not reveal D to the server. So if we also, if we want our encoding to really be an encoding of D in the sense that the information of D is within that coding, I see basically two options for how to set this up, right? So one is, let's say our encoding is actually split into two parts, right? So for the purpose of this slide, I'll say one of the parts is classical, one of the parts is quantum. But given the two parts together, that actually encodes your data D. But given either of them, you kind of have no information about D. So then what you could do is assume these two parts don't mix, or like the servers that hold them don't collude. And then you could ask one of them, the one holding the quantum part, to delete their share of your data, right? And if they do that, the goal would be to say that after they deleted that data, then even if the servers collude and combine their shares together, they won't be able to recover D from that. Whereas, of course, before they could have, right? And so this scenario is kind of one way to view, so there's this work of Broadbent and Islam that inspired a lot of follow-up works on this concept of cryptography with certified deletion. And this is one way to view their setting, where one of these shares is kind of a one-time pad style key, and the other share is like a quantum ciphertext. Neither of them information theoretically has D, but you can still delete the ciphertext and have the guarantee that when you combine them together later, D is lost. Okay, so this is a notion of deletion that makes sense, right? So on the other hand, you might want to say, kind of come up with a way to just come up with a single encoding that actually does have your data D encoded in it, which actually is important for a few applications of this. And so the other option is then you can say, well, let's bound our server in some way. Let's say that they're quantum polynomial time, and kind of assume our encoding is an encryption in some sense, right? So we assume that the server, given your encoding, can't recover D, even though it might live in there, right? And the client keeps a key that would allow them to decrypt. And so here we can hope to say that, if you then ask the server to delete that data, they can do that, and suddenly D kind of disappears from inside their box, right? Before they had D with them, they just couldn't really access it without the key. After deletion, it's gone. And so this would be useful because maybe what this would actually guarantee is that even given unbounded time after deletion, the server couldn't kind of brute force recover D. They couldn't even recover D maybe if the client's key leaked later. So this means that there's really whatever the server does, they would never be able to recover D after this point. Okay. And this setting, or something quite close to the setting, was first studied in this work of Hiroko Morimai, Nishimaki, and Yamakawa. Except their security definition was slightly weaker. They just said that after deletion, they still assume the server is quantum polynomial time, but they say that they can't recover D even given the client's secret key, which is, of course, still quite a meaningful notion of deletion. All right. So, yeah, hopefully this kind of sets up the scenario that we're going to be trying to prove security about. And so I can move on to the first part of our paper, which is where we kind of give a generic compiler for achieving this, for achieving deletion in these scenarios, right? So we first revisit kind of this Broadbent and Islam construction or setting through the lens of 2 out of 2 secret sharing. And we obtain a simple construction of this. And maybe the main step in our paper is to say, so this achieves kind of that first setting where we kind of secret share our data. Then we want to say, does this actually imply, or can we use this to achieve kind of the second setting where we encode data in a single state and kind of upload it to a server, right? And so the main part of our paper is compiling the secret sharing setting to a public key encryption scheme with certified deletion and developing a new proof technique that allows us to actually prove this stronger notion of deletion where after the server deletes your data, we can guarantee that D is kind of statistically gone from their view, right? And then we noticed that what we did was actually quite general, and we can start using it to obtain certified deletion guarantees for a whole wide variety of cryptographic primitives, not just public key encryption. Okay. And I'll say more about those results later in the talk. So yeah, let's just start with a secret sharing setting. And this classical 2 out of 2 secret sharing is perhaps one of the simplest cryptographic primitives that exists. So to share a bit B, you just sample a random bit x. One of the shares is x, and the other share is b masked with x, right? But our goal now is to add some certified deletion functionality to this. So we would want to say that we allow one of these shareholders to delete their share. And in that case, we want B to be hidden or kind of statistically gone, even given both shares, right? So here we have to introduce some quantum uncertainty. So we'll just simply sample a random basis. Either let's say theta 0 is the classical or the standard basis, theta 1 is the Hadamard basis, and we'll just encode x into one of these two bases at random, right? And then we'll have to give the basis information in the other share, right? So the reason this is useful is because if you measure this quantum share in the wrong basis, you will kind of completely destroy information about x, right? But in order to get actually like negligible security, we'll kind of have to repeat this idea, and so we'll sample like lambda. Lambda is the security parameter. We'll sample lambda of these like BB84 states, right? And throughout this talk, I will always use this notation where I'll say, so given a set of bases, theta, I'll set T to be the subset of these bases that are in the standard basis, right? So these are the subset of indices that encode information in the standard basis. T bar is the subset of indices that encode information in the Hadamard basis. And what we're going to do is we're just going to mask our bit B with all of the xi's that are encoded in the standard basis. Okay, so of course, if you measure, this share in the standard basis, you'll recover enough information, all the information you need to combine it with the first share and recover B. But on the other hand, if you instead measure all those BB84 states in the Hadamard basis, right, you will be kind of destroying all the information about those xi's for I and T, right? So that's just exactly the deletion procedure. Just measure all your states in the Hadamard basis. And then, of course, we need a way to check that the person that was doing this actually did this somewhat honestly. So we'll consider x prime to be a valid deletion certificate, right, if it matches x at all of the Hadamard basis positions. So this is kind of a guarantee that, or it's supposed to be a guarantee that this, if x prime satisfies this property, then basically these states were all or almost all measured in the Hadamard basis, right? So far this is pretty straightforward, especially given prior work. This is very similar to the broadband Islam construction. One slight difference is that kind of the bit that we use to mask B is, you could say it's computed using like an XOR extractor. So we kind of take all these xi's and extract one bit of randomness from it by XORing them together, whereas Broadbent and Islam used a seeded extractor, which introduced kind of a seed also to this construction. Right. And then, okay, so like I said, this kind of gives a template for certified deletion in this like secret sharing setting, and our next goal is to compile this and obtain a scheme in the single server setting, right? So to do that, we'll just let enc be any semantically secure encryption scheme, okay? And kind of naturally, if we want to like combine these into a single encryption, of course we can't give them both in the clear. What we'll do is just encrypt the classical share and then give the quantum share in the clear, right? So a encryption with certified deletion of a bit B is just going to be a regular encryption of the classical share along with these quantum states, right? And since like kind of theta, like basically since this classical share is encrypted, it should still be the case that the person holding this encryption can't cheat in their deletion step, right? So in other words, they should have to, in order to prove that they deleted it in a valid way, they should have to measure or roughly measure all of their quantum states in the Hadamard basis. So again, this is quite similar to both the broadband Islam construction and HMNY. But maybe the more interesting part of my talk will be coming up, which is where we kind of formalize the security that we want out of this scheme, and then show how to actually prove that it satisfies that security property. Okay. So First, I'll say that we just need like some standard semantic security from the scheme, which I won't cover in this talk. What I'll want to cover is this notion of like certified everlasting security, which is kind of, we want to, formally define and prove what we want when the adversary does produce a valid deletion certificate. Okay. Good, so this is the security game. We'll just let ENC be any encryption scheme secure against some adversary A. And let's just consider what happens when we encrypt a bit B. Okay. So this is just basically what I wrote on the last slide. We'll sample lambda BB84 states. We'll send the adversary an encryption of B under this scheme that I just described. And then we'll let the adversary do something, whatever they want to do. And we'll parse their output as a potential deletion certificate X prime. And we'll let rho just be their final state after this, so whatever remaining registers they operated on. And since we want to capture what happens in the case of a successful deletion, we're essentially just going to abort the experiment if they were not successful. Okay, so we're just going to output bot if their deletion certificate wasn't successful. Otherwise, we'll output their final state. And we want to compare what happens when the adversary receives an encryption of 0 versus what happens when they receive an encryption of 1. Okay, and our claim will be, or what we want to prove, is that the outputs of these games, of these experiments, are statistically close, regardless of whether they got an encryption of 0 or 1. Okay, so we just say that these outputs are kind of close in trace distance, right? And this is capturing the fact that they kind of no longer have any information about what bit they started with. And I guess this is non-trivial because the distributions that they start with, that they're initialized with, are statistically far, right? For example, if ENC is a public key encryption scheme. So what we're trying to capture is the fact that the adversary starts with some statistically far distributions, produces a deletion certificate, and then after this, suddenly their final states become statistically close. Okay. So I think, I do actually just want to go through and kind of like sketch the actual security proof we use, because I think it's probably the most interesting part of our paper. So we're just going to use a hybrid argument, right? So let's just start with the real game, which is, I'm just calling that real game that I described on the last slide as hybrid 0, parameterizing it by the bit that the adversary gets. And we're going to basically want to go through a sequence of hybrids until we reach a hybrid where it's clear, or where we can show that that hybrid is statistically close, whether it's b equals 0 or b equals 1. And kind of the tricky thing is that because we're proving a statistical claim, we need each of our hybrids to be statistically close. Okay. So the thing that we're going to want to capture about this game, or intuitively, is that for the adversary to produce a valid X prime, we want to roughly capture the fact that they must be measuring all of their states in the Hadamard basis, right? And that's really going to rely on the fact that the adversary doesn't know what theta is, right? Because if they did, then they can just measure the Hadamard basis states in the Hadamard basis and leave the other ones unmeasured. So the key difficulty of this proof is going to say, well, we really want to prove a claim about, or it really seems like we need to kind of show that the adversary doesn't know what theta is, right? But we're giving the adversary theta, albeit in encrypted form, okay? So we need to deal with that fact. And this prior work that I've mentioned of HMNY deals with this by assuming that ENC is a non-committing encryption scheme, okay? And they have a step in their proof where indeed they kind of switch from a hybrid where theta is encrypted to a hybrid where theta is no longer encrypted. You just give them zeros, right? So this has a couple of drawbacks. First of all, this compromises kind of the generality of this approach, right? So for example, I think a really fascinating application of certified deletion is delegation, or like fully homomorphic encryption. So if we wanted our encryption scheme to be homomorphic, and we wanted to say like outsource some computation, and then later have that information deleted, so exactly like what Alex was talking about earlier today, we wouldn't be able to give any results about that, assuming that ENC is non-committing, because we don't know how to construct a non-committing encryption that's also fully homomorphic. Okay. So that's one thing. If we assume that, then this compromises the generality of the approach. It also doesn't suffice for proving the security notion that we want to prove, which is this everlasting security or the statistical security notion, right? So in our approach, we'll we'll have a different technique where, again, we're capturing this fact that the adversary's strategy must be close to measuring all their states in the Hadamard basis, but we want to show this without actually defining an explicit hybrid where theta is removed from their view. Okay. Good. So so now I'll just get into the proof. Like the first thing we do is maybe a little bit silly, but we just we basically want to show that like this bit B is removed from the adversary's final state in some sense. So the first thing we're doing is just going to basically delay the dependence of the experiment on B until the very end. Okay. And to do that, we'll just replace that bit that the adversary gets with the uniformly random bit. And then later, at the very end of the experiment, we'll just like check if we guessed right. Okay. So we just like add this like check at the end, like, oh, did we actually guess B prime correctly? Based on like the B that we're given, that was supposed to be given to us, right? And this is no different than just deciding to abort the experiment at the beginning with some probability 1/2. So it suffices to prove that like kind of these distributions are statistically close, right? So this seemed maybe a little silly, but it actually simplifies things a lot. So now the only place where this experiment actually depends on B is at the very end in this check, right? So now it suffices to show that this bit, like the XOR of all these xi's, is uniformly random from the adversary's perspective. So to do that, we have to say something about these randomly sampled x's, right? And our next step is to kind of purify the experiment and delay the sampling of these xi's until after the adversary x, like basically outputs their x prime and rho, right? So this is quite a common proof technique. And in quantum cryptography, we just replace these BB84 states with halves of EPR pairs, and then we only kind of measure these what I'll call like the outer registers here to obtain x kind of after the adversary outputs x prime and rho. Okay. So this is a way to delay the dependence of the experiment on x until after the adversary has acted. So okay. Now we can try to analyze this experiment and come up with a reason like why we should expect these xi's to be random bits, right? And I'll just rewrite this experiment in a couple ways first before defining a new hybrid. So first we'll just see that we're just like measuring these lambda qubits in the theta basis, so some in the standard, some in the Hadamard basis, and then we're doing a check on the Hadamard basis positions, followed by a check on the standard basis positions, and then finally we're completing. So we can just split these explicitly into two parts. So first measure the Hadamard basis positions, then measure the standard basis positions. And this measurement can also just be written as like, basically what we're doing is we're taking these registers, we're trying to project the T-bar part of these onto X prime in the Hadamard basis. Right, so that's exactly what I just described. We're basically going to try to perform that projection. If it fails, we'll give up. If it succeeds, we'll continue. Right. So, so now, intuitively, what we want to capture again is that these xi's are random, right? And we're obtaining them by measuring certain qubits in the standard basis. So, one thing that would be nice is if we could show that if these qubits were in a Hadamard basis state, right, then we would just get pure uniform randomness by measuring them in the standard basis, right? Okay, so then let me say that, we're not doing anything yet to these T qubits, but we're kind of projecting the T-bar qubits onto a Hadamard basis state. So our next hybrid is going to basically capture the intuition I just described, which is instead of projecting only the T-bar qubits onto a Hadamard basis state, we'll try to project all of the qubits roughly onto a Hadamard basis state. So it's not going to be exactly that for some technical reasons, but we're going to change this projection to, of course, project these onto X prime, but then project the T registers onto kind of a state that's close in Hamming distance to X prime in the Hadamard basis. Okay. And so again, this should be kind of intuitive in the sense that in this way, this is kind of capturing the fact that for the adversary to produce a successful X prime, they must have roughly measured their halves of the qubits in the Hadamard basis. Okay. But now, once we reach this hybrid, then we're good because we're measuring these T qubits in the standard basis, and if we ever got to this step, we're guaranteed that those qubits are kind of close in some sense to a Hadamard basis state. And we can basically apply this lemma that actually we came up with in a recent work with Amit Agarwal and Nishant Kumar in the context of quantum oblivious transfer that basically shows that if you measure a state like this in the standard basis and XOR all the qubits together, you'll get like a pure uniformly random bit. This is basically where we use the extractor properties of XOR. Okay. So this is good. I mean, once we reach this hybrid 3, we can actually prove that actually the distributions are identical, whether you're initialized with b equals 0 or b equals 1. And the only remaining thing that I haven't really discussed is, we switched from hybrid 2 to hybrid 3 by kind of expanding this projection, kind of making it more stringent. But I never argued yet that, we could do that. So why is the statistical distance between hybrid 2 and hybrid 3 negligible? And also note that I haven't even used the security of the encryption scheme yet either. So this step is where we're going to use that. So the first thing to note is that, okay, so in hybrid 2, the only difference is in hybrid 2 we're performing a particular projection. In hybrid 3 we're kind of performing a little bit more of like a stringent projection on these qubits. And so the only thing that would cause the adversary to distinguish these two hybrids, the only way they could possibly be far, is if like this 2 projection accepts, but the 3 projection rejects. Okay, that's the only event that the adversary could actually notice, right? But this is finally where we can use the security of the encryption scheme. So note that it suffices to actually show by semantic security that this same claim holds when we give the adversary an encryption of zeros rather than of theta. Okay. And note that we're not using semantic security or like computational security to directly prove that the trace distance between these two distributions is negligible. We're just using it to show that it suffices to prove that this probability is negligible, right? So this is something that we can actually set up like a reduction to semantic security, right? But once we do that, now the adversary has no information about theta at all, and so this becomes like a purely information theoretic claim, right? And just because of the fact that the adversary doesn't know which thetas are going to be sampled, intuitively, if a large subset of their qubits are projected onto X prime in the Hadamard basis, then the other remaining subset should roughly be as well. And this is a scenario that's actually already been analyzed in the literature previously in this paper of Bowman and Fair. Okay. So yeah, that is the proof technique, and sorry if that got a little bit in the weeds. I can now just like summarize that a little bit, like coming back out a little bit. What we've done is we've just started with the real security game. The first 2 hybrids you can kind of see them as like purifying the experiment, delaying the sampling of like the actual information that we want to show is random, right? And then in this key step, going from hybrid 2 to hybrid 3, we capture the intuitive fact that the adversary must be measuring most of their states in the Hadamard basis by kind of applying this approximate projection on what I'm calling kind of the outer registers of the EPR pairs we set up. Okay, and the key thing is all of these hybrids are statistically close. There's no hybrid we defined where we removed theta. We only really used that to prove that these 2 hybrids, 2 and 3, are statistically close. Okay. And then finally in hybrid 3, we can prove that these distributions are identical. So this completes the proof. Okay. And so now I can zoom out even further and say, note that we only use the fact that ENC was a semantically secure encryption scheme, so we can start kind of plugging in a bunch of different cryptographic primitives to ENC. Okay. And we obtained these results. So what I've basically just described is public key encryption with certified deletion, which is improving on this prior work that kind of just obtain this weaker definition where the adversary was still assumed to be computationally bounded after deletion. Okay, and we can plug in a bunch of other ones. I wanted to highlight again this notion of fully homomorphic encryption that we can obtain now, which then improves on this prior work, which we just heard about today, that also considers this weaker definition and has a conjectured security statement. Okay, and then we also obtained some other primitives that were previously only known in the quantum random oracle model. Okay, and so this is all just by kind of instantiating ENC with different schemes. And so maybe like the main takeaway of this section is just that kind of simple quantum information, like simple BB84 states, gives rise to this pretty generic, what you could call an everlasting security compiler that works for many different cryptographic primitives. Okay. Good. So moving on, I can kind of explain the next part of our work, which starts to deal with a new setting, right? So suppose that we wanted to consider the setting of two or multi-party cryptography, where we have, where we have multiple parties now, each with potentially their own private inputs, and they want to do something interesting with each other, maybe compute a function over their private inputs. And the key thing that differentiates this setting from what we've just discussed is that now we want to allow for the possibility of either of these parties being adversarial, and we'll kind of want certified deletion guarantees against either of those parties, right? So the main question that we want to answer in this work is, can quantum information provide any useful notion of deletion in this setting, like this two or multi-party cryptography setting? So to answer this, we'll have to look at some prior work on the subject. And in really like one of the most fundamental results of quantum crypto, so Myers, Lowe, and Chow showed in the late 90s that unconditionally secure bit commitment is impossible. Okay, so why is this relevant? Well, bit commitment can be seen as, perhaps like the simplest two-party crypto primitive, right? Because we want kind of, binding security against one party, hiding security against the other. And so what this establishes is that you can't, at least you can't hope for just statistical security against both parties, right? But that's fine. I mean, we couldn't hope for statistical security in public key encryption either. What we were able to show is that we could get everlasting security conditioned on a successful deletion, okay? So you could wonder whether in two-party cryptography something similar might happen, where maybe if you assume that the parties are computationally bounded during the protocol, then you could obtain everlasting security guarantees after the protocol, right? So unfortunately, this was also ruled out. So Unruh showed about 10 years ago that even this is impossible, and he was able to reduce this to, basically these earlier impossibility results. Okay, and so this holds, everlasting secure computation against every party is impossible, even if the parties are bounded during the protocol, even if the protocol is semi-honest, right? So this kind of rules out any notion of certified deletion in this setting. Okay. And then before I talk about our notion, I should note that I should discuss what you can actually just do classically, right? And here, while we can achieve unconditional security against both parties or every party, we can achieve statistical security against some subset of parties. For example, commitments can either be statistically binding or statistically hiding. Zero knowledge protocols can either be proofs or statistically zero knowledge. And it's people have even studied this notion of one-sided statistical security in the more general secure computation setting. So given prior work, it seems like, we can't achieve, we definitely can't achieve unconditional security against every party. Classically, we can achieve unconditional security against any fixed subset of parties, right? So, in this work, we actually show that there is an intermediate notion that is impossible classically, but becomes possible quantumly. And we call this notion everlasting security transfer, okay? So here, we'll just have our usual setting of, for now, I'm just going to talk about two-party computation. But we want it to be the case that after the protocol, maybe, P1 wants to just request to P2, like, please delete my data, in the sense that, because the protocol was computationally secure, maybe D2 has some, remaining like encrypted data about, P1's input D1. But we want it to be the case that after P2 responds to this deletion request, then all information about P1's input should now be statistically removed from P2's view. Okay. But another thing to note, like to make this kind of interesting or like a useful concept, we should also have the guarantee that like, by computing the certificate of deletion, this doesn't leak any additional information about P2's input, at least computationally. But we also want, maybe to allow for the possibility of the other way. So maybe P2 instead wants to delete P1's data, right? And so we should be able to handle this. So our definition is to stipulate that after the protocol, okay, either party can request deletion from the other party if they wanted. And they could even do that even if the protocol was, say, statistically secure against P1. We want to allow for the fact that P1 requests deletion from P2, and suddenly the protocol then becomes statistically secure against P2. Okay, so this is why we call it transfer. But and I should note also that this does imply it's kind of can be seen as a generalization of some notions that have already been considered in the literature, like statistically binding commitments with certified everlasting hiding, or zero knowledge proofs with certified everlasting zero knowledge. Okay. And to further maybe motivate the definition, I can discuss a toy problem in the setting of MPC. So this definition also applies to MPC, where like basically you could request any set of parties to delete your data, essentially. So just as a toy problem, say that say that we want to use MPC to run an election. So everyone submits their private votes, and they kind of tally the votes and elect two parties among them, right? So what this security notion would allow us to do is for like kind of the unelected parties, let's say P1, P4, P5, to request that after the protocol completes, request that the elected parties delete their inputs or delete their votes, right? So whereas before P2 and P3 might have some computational information about the other party's votes, like basically who did or didn't vote for them, after we request the deletion, we can kind of guarantee that all that information is statistically removed from their view. And so the reason that I'm using this problem to motivate the question is, or the security definition is that it's important that we didn't really know who we wanted statistical security against until after the protocol completes. Okay. So, unlike the last section, I won't go into technical details here. I'll just kind of give our results and encourage you to see the paper for those details. So we introduced this notion. We start by just constructing commitments with everlasting security transfer, and we show how to do this from just kind of vanilla or standard statistically binding computational hiding commitments, plus our BB84 stage compiler, which we actually have to apply kind of on both sides for some technical reasons. We prove a sequential composition theorem for protocols that satisfy this definition, which allows us to rely on prior work to obtain like two and multi-party computation with everlasting security transfer. Okay. And as like a higher level outlook, I think this is kind of a new type of quantum advantage that you can hope for in secure computation, right? So, there's been a lot of prior work and about how, using quantum communication, you can build secure computation protocols from weaker assumptions than what are known classically, right? So our work is showing that not only can you do that, you can also obtain a better security definition than what is possible classically, right? So we add this EST notion. And I just wanted to say this asterisk here because, this dimension of better security has been studied before in kind of like idealized models such as bounded storage or signature card models. So whereas our paper is getting kind of this, like showing that you can obtain better security in the plane model for the first time. Okay. All right. So good. I have a few minutes just to cover the last part of my talk, which is just a little bit about this follow-up work that we have. I really won't go into much detail at all. But another setting that you can consider, so kind of yet another setting that I haven't talked about yet, is this software distribution setting, right? Which we've also kind of already heard about earlier today in the context of unclonability. So suppose you want to distribute a functionality, encode it in a quantum state that allows anyone, or say allows the client to come use that quantum state and evaluate inputs of their choice on it, right? But maybe you're in like a subscription model or something like that. You might want to, after they interact with the program for a while, you might want to go and ask them to delete that program, right? And so we would want the guarantee that after they delete the program, suddenly they no longer have access to F, right? So this is kind of a new setting that we want to consider. And basically what this means is that from the quantum encoding, the client shouldn't be able to learn a complete description of F, or otherwise they could just copy that, okay? But they should be able to learn some partial information about F in the sense that they can just evaluate it on inputs of their choice. So this should require some notion of like program obfuscation, right, instead of encryption. And moreover, it should require something like quite different than what we've already been discussing, which is that the quantum encoding has to be publicly accessible in some sense, which I'm not going to really make that concrete, but the quantum encoding itself should be useful to the client. They should be able to interact with it, whereas before it was okay if that encoding was just kind of a locked box, right? So using BB84 states, we don't know how to do this, and this is a common old problem because basically BB84 states are learnable, given kind of an oracle that describes them, right? And so we're going to use some older tricks, and what's been observed before is that BB84 states are just a special case of these more general class of quantum states called subspace coset states, right? Where we just take the kind of axis-aligned subspace and randomize it and make it actually a uniformly random subspace. And so the key point is that when we move from BB84 states to general subspace coset states, this learnability attack kind of goes away. And given kind of oracle access to S, or like S plus V, the coset that you're interacting with, doesn't actually imply anymore that you can then learn the description of your state. Okay, and so this will turn out to be very useful for us. But kind of like the main thing, one main thing to note is that if we just kind of replace BB84 states with subspace coset states in our security game, essentially the same type of proof goes through. And so here, instead of masking our bit B with the xi's that were encoded in the standard basis, we'll mask it with kind of the bits in the vector describing the kind of the random coset that we've encoded, right? And this is the analog of that. And we can even give the adversary some more information. For example, we can even give them like a kind of a random superspace of S plus V, and this actually turns out to be crucial for our applications, okay? But essentially the same type of proof technique goes through using subspace coset states rather than BB84 states. And we use this technique to kind of come up with this generic encoding technique that allows for something more than what I've discussed in the first part of this talk, which is basically the ability to repeatedly access information inside this encoded state and later kind of certifiably delete the rest of the information, right? And so, for example, we can obtain kind of CCA secure encryption with certified deletion, which has not been studied before. I didn't really get much of a chance to talk about FHE and blind delegation, which I think is a great application of certified deletion, but we make some improvements to this. For example, we can show the first protocol that's secure against malicious servers. We can even obtain a protocol that's just 2 messages. And then how I motivated this part, we can obtain kind of this notion of obfuscation with certified deletion. Okay. And I'll note that there's actually a concurrent work we're aware of that obtains some similar results to this. Okay. And yeah, so that's all I wanted to say. So thanks for listening, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, James. So if you have any question, please raise your hand. So I have a question in the previous slide.
Yeah.
So you also achieved the unbounded collision functional encryption. This is certified everlasting setting?
In the certified everlasting setting, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I see.
Yep.
Any other questions? On the Zoom chat, no question? No. Okay, so let's thanks. Contribute talk session. Julia, please.
Microphone.
hear me? アナウンサーNo, I cannot hear you. I cannot hear you. Okay, so this is a joint work with Takashi Yamakawa, and for details, please see this paper. So in classical cryptography, we have many cryptographic primitives, and we know their relations. So for example, in Minicrypt, we have one-way functions, and all these primitives are known to be equivalent to. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me now by any chance? No. Move on to the next talk. So maybe let's wait 1 minute until our next speaker sets up.
Okay, good morning. Can you hear me all right? Okay, perfect. Yeah. Should I just get started or do you want to wait to stick to the schedule? All right, cool. Well, then I'll get started. Yeah, so thanks. Oops. Someone trying to say something? Okay, if not, I'll just get started. So yeah, thanks to the organizers for organizing this workshop. I'll talk about joint work with Alexander Georgiou and Alexander Paremba on what we call quantum crypto with classical communication. So basically the motivating question here is to try and understand what quantum crypto primitives actually require, the exchange of quantum states between different parties, and what quantum crypto primitives we can already achieve if we have purely classical communication, but maybe additional assumptions like computational assumptions. And the kind of specific angle that we take on this is that we want to study what quantum crypto protocols that may have quantum communication we can sort of dequantize in the sense of turning them into protocols that only have classical communication. So I'll mostly talk about this dequantization transformation here. This will start from some existing quantum crypto protocol. I call it the original protocol. So this we assume someone else has constructed and has proven secure. And this protocol must have a sort of specific structure, and then we can transform it in a generic way to a dequantized protocol that has purely classical communication. So what's the structure? We consider two-party protocols. So we have Alice and Bob. And the first message in the protocol must be Alice just sending random BB84 states to Bob. So these are the BB84 states. Alice sends over n of them. I write them like this, where this theta I here is called the basis choice, and Vi is called the value of the BB84 state. And like just for intuition, why is this a common or useful first step? That's because, now Alice, she picked these BB84 states, so she knows what theta I and Vi are. But Bob kind of doesn't, right? Bob just receives these states, so in some sense he has some information about what theta I and Vi are. He can sort of try and use them, but he doesn't really know what these values are in a classical sense. So that's just for intuition why this is a useful first step. And then the rest of the protocol we don't really care about as long as it's purely classical communication. So we can now divide this up into kind of quantum part here, which is Alice's state generation and sending over the states. And then Bob may be quantum throughout the protocol, but just measure parts of a state to generate these classical answers in the protocol. And then this part here is classical. And now in this dequantized protocol, really, the thing that we want to do is replace the step of sending the BB84 states by some interactive classical protocol that achieves kind of much the same thing. Because if we do this, then the setup looks like this, where now Alice is purely classical, as is the communication. So, this classical protocol here takes the place of sending the random BB84 states. But of course, Bob may still be quantum here, or more precisely, for a computationally efficient Bob to be able to succeed in the protocol, it may be necessary for Bob to do some quantum operations. So this 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 classical protocol here, we call a protocol for parallel remote state preparation, because it allows Alice to kind of remotely prepare in Bob's memory these BB84 states in parallel in tensor product. And this really needs to achieve in a very strong sense the same thing as just sending over these states. So it also needs to give Alice these values theta I and vi, and it can't kind of leak these values to Bob, right? Bob sort of must prepare these states, but in a blind way where he doesn't actually know which states he has prepared. Okay, so before saying a little bit more about what exactly this means on a technical level, let me just run you through the sort of pros and cons of doing this transformation. So the obvious thing that we gain when we do this, and that's the whole point of doing this, is that we move from a setting where Alice needs some quantum capabilities and a quantum channel between Alice and Bob, to a setting where Alice is purely classical and they only need classical communication. What do we pay for it? The first thing that we pay is a computational assumption. So I haven't specified, what exactly this protocol is. So it may already use some computational assumption, but it may also be information theoretically secure. And in that case, once you, dequantize it using this transformation, you necessarily introduce a computational assumption, because this parallel RSP protocol here relies on a computational assumption. And specifically, the assumption is that Bob here is unable to break LWE. The other thing that we lose is that this original protocol here may have negligible sinus error, roughly meaning that a dishonest Bob can only succeed with negligible probability. But this dequantized protocol will have inverse polynomial sinus error, which is, of course, worse. And finally, just to dispel any notion that this is meant to be something to make quantum crypto more near-term feasible experimentally or something, it will in general be much easier for Bob to implement this original protocol than this dequantized protocol. So even though Bob here has to be, quantum, for many protocols, he still only needs to perform relatively easy quantum operations. Whereas in this dequantized protocol in general, there's quite considerable kind of quantum overhead that makes Bob's life much harder. So I really want to stress that, of course, in some sense, having classical communication protocols is more sort of experimentally feasible. And the way that we do this right now, and our motivation here is not to make this somehow near-term feasible, but rather just to understand on a fundamental level what crypto primitives we can implement in this dequantized setting and which we can't. Okay, so let me give you just some examples of protocols to which we can apply this transformation. Let's see what we get. So, in this setting, there are many quantum crypto protocols. The most famous one is for quantum key distribution. So this is the original BB84 protocol, which also is the namesake for these quantum states. And the goal here is that Alice and Bob want to generate a shared secret key. Right? So the protocol does follow this template form with Alice sending over these BB84 states and then some classic communication. So we can apply our dequantization transformation here. But when we do this, what do we get? Well, we get a protocol for key distribution with classical communication under LWE. Right? So this is really just like the world's silliest public key distribution protocol. So while in principle you can apply this transformation, it really doesn't yield anything interesting. Now these primitives down here I want to explain in detail, but the kind of crucial point here is that these are all primitives for which there is no analog in a purely classical world. So once we apply this dequantization transformation, again, there exist protocols for all of these that have this form, then we get out protocols with classical communication that nonetheless require Bob to be quantum here in order to be able to succeed with limited computational resources. And as a result, we get something that's kind of interesting, which is these inherently quantum crypto protocols with purely classical communication. So as a general kind of rule, if you like, this is useful or interesting for protocols that achieve primitives that are impossible in purely classical crypto and really leverage the fact that Bob here may still be required to be quantum. Okay, so let me just briefly say on a technical level what this parallel RSP protocol, which is really like the key technical thing that we need to prove, what this shows. What it shows is that, or what we prove, like what its sinus guarantee is that you run this interactive protocol between Alice and Bob, and then at the end of the interaction, if Alice accepts Bob, then the joint state of Alice and Bob must be close to this. So what is this? So this is just the expectation of a uniform basis, choices, and values here, corresponding to the fact that Alice wants to prepare remotely, and uniformly random BB84 states. Then this is Alice's sort of classical knowledge of which bases and values she prepared in Bob's memory. So this register belongs to Alice. Now we move on to Bob's register. So these are the BB84 states that Bob has been kind of, forced to prepare. And finally, Bob may also prepare some sort of ancilla state. This we can't prevent, but what we need to prove is that this ancilla state is independent of these values theta I and vi. So this then really matches the kind of situation that you would have after sending the BB84 states in the original protocol, where Alice knows the classical values of the BB84 states. Bob has the BB84 states, but Bob kind of doesn't have any additional information about which BB84 states he has in any other part of his quantum memory. So the reason I phrase it with this language of, the joint state at the end of the protocol is that in the security proofs of these original protocols, right, the ones that we want to apply the transformation to, you can always phrase them by saying, as the first line of the proof without loss of generality, assume that after I was sending over these NBB84 states, the joint state is this. And once you phrase your security proof in this way, you can just sort of drop in this protocol instead, and the security guarantee kind of slots right into your original first line of the proof, and then you can dequantize them in a fairly straightforward and easy manner. Okay, so there are a couple of caveats here. One is that we, as I said, require that Bob can't break RBE. We also can't actually show that the state is, close to this state in an information theoretic sense. It's computationally indistinguishable from this state. And finally, Bob may also apply some business transformation on his part of the state. So all of this turns out to be not a problem when you actually want to use it for dequantizing protocols. Okay, so instead of saying anything, okay, there was some terrible feedback, but I hope it's fine now. Yeah, okay. So let me just, instead of saying anything about the proof, just mention some related work so you have some sense of the proof techniques at least. So this really builds on Mahadev's original sort of idea of using post-quantum TCFs to constrain what a quantum prover can do. So, this is like the original work that introduced this idea, and then it's been developed in multiple sort of subsequent works that strengthen these techniques to sort of more self-testing or remote state preparation-like tasks. And I also want to mention that, we have this generic dequantization transformation, which, as I said, has some downsides. Most notably, it introduces inverse Pauli sinus error. There are also what I call application-specific dequantizations, which are basically, you focus on one particular application and you construct a classical communication protocol using these same techniques. This has been done for a number of primitives. This is not a generic transformation. As I said, our kind of motivation here is to try and understand on a high level what protocols can you in principle dequantize. But the big advantage of doing this in this application-specific way is that you preserve negligible sinus error. So if you actually want like the best, classical communication protocol for these primitives, you shouldn't apply our generic transformation, but you should use these more tailor-made approaches. Okay, so let me end on some open questions. Of course, you can now apply this transformation to additional protocols, and you can also reduce the overhead on Bob's side if you actually do care about practical implementability at some point. But I think the most interesting thing also from a technical point of view is to see whether we can get rid of this negligible sinus error issue, so preserving the negligible sinus error and not degrading it to inverse Pauli. And this may require some sort of weaker definition of RSP. So Jia Zhang has one proposal which looks very promising, but I don't think we've really explored at this point whether it gets us all of the dequantization that we want. You could also hope that you do some sort of like unclonability property directly from post-quantum crypto without going via RSP at all. This might also be an approach to preserving negligible standards error. All right, yes, so I'll stop here. Thanks.
Talk. In the hope that the problem fix itself. Can someone hear me? No.
I can hear you. I'm not sure whether you can hear me.
You can hear me. Nice. Yeah, so
Now it's good, yeah.
again.
Can everyone hear me? Is this working well? Okay, great. All right, so I think, should I wait another couple of minutes or already get started?
Please.
So, my name is Marcel, and I'm going to talk a little bit about joint work with Nick Spooner, also from the University of Warwick, on the notion of collapsing and and other notions of binding for quantum commitments. I should say that I'll focus only on the post-quantum setting here, but all of these results extend to quantum commitments as well as from bit to string commitments. So I'll use as the benchmark here bit commitments in like the post-quantum security setting. Okay, so this is a talk a little bit about definitions. So I hope you'll bear with me when I just define what is a bit commitment scheme and what is binding for it. And this is mostly just a set notation. Okay, so bit commitment scheme consists of two algorithms, a generator that samples a key, and then a function of three inputs that takes in a key, a bit, and an opening, and we say that the C is a commitment to the bit B when this expression holds. And the usual notion of computational binding against classical adversaries is that any polynomial time adversary can't output two openings to different bits. Okay, of course, all of this extends to string commitments, but I'll focus on the bit case for now. All right. So now I'll describe, an experiment or a classical game that captures this notion of security, and we'll see how, when we go to the quantum setting, this causes problems. Okay, so what is the sum binding game? You have a challenger that communicates with an adversary. The challenger samples a key, sends it over. The adversary responds with some commitment string. Then the challenger asks the adversary to open to a random bit B, and the adversary succeeds if it sends a valid opening to this bit. And again, this also extends to the string case. So this is one way to extend, the notion of sum binding or the experiment to multi-bit messages. But I'll briefly explain another way of doing this, which turns out to be important for our setting. So in the chosen bit binding game, the game works roughly the same way. The difference is that when the adversary sends a commitment string, it also sends a coordinate of its string. Then the challenger asks the adversary to open to some bit B, and the adversary has to respond with an opening that opens a message whose ith bit matches B. Okay, so I won't talk much about this notion anymore, but I just wanted to sort of, highlight this because this turns out to be quite important in our work. All right, so the notion of sum binding says that if the adversary is polynomial time, then it can't succeed much with much higher probability than it would if it just, say, committed to a fixed bit and decommitted to it when it asked to open for that. And it's simple enough to show that in the classical setting, computational binding is equivalent to sum binding. However, in the quantum case, this is not true anymore. And the reason is that in order to prove this equivalence, we rewind our adversary to simulate two runs of the game. And in order to get two openings. However, in the quantum case, it could be that the adversary could feasibly open to either bit, but it can't open to both. Okay, so the way we fix this is by defining a new notion of computational binding for quantum adversaries that turns out to be stronger, at least syntactically, than the computational binding one. So let me describe this game briefly. In this game, the challenger, again, samples a key in a bit, and now the adversary sends, along with the commitment string, some two quantum registers corresponding to the message and the opening. Now, the challenger has flipped this bit. If the bit is 1, then it measures this message register. If not, then it does nothing. Then it sends back the two quantum registers, and the adversary's task is to try and guess whether the state was measured or not. Okay, so this is a notion that strengthens, at least syntactically, the notion of computational binding. But at least so far, we didn't know whether these notions coincide. There is also an extra condition here that basically says that this message and opening superposition has to be supported on sort of valid strings. We can remove this assumption by just having the challenger measure whether this is true or not. Okay, so now let me move on to our results. And because these are in a sense simple enough, I'll try to give like a proof sketch of both of our main results. So the first one is it was previously unknown whether there was some gap between these notions of sum and collapse binding. And our first result shows that this is actually tight. Like the two notions coincide for bit commitments, and for string commitments, we need to use this generalization of the sum binding game that I call the chosen bit binding game. But again, these are equivalent for string commitments as well. Okay, now using this equivalence between sum and collapse binding, we can also investigate or also ask the question of whether there is some gap between computational binding and sum binding against quantum adversaries. And here it turns out that we can't prove anything like either way unconditionally, but if there exists a gap, then we can extract lots of useful quantum cryptography from it. So this uses some recent quantum rewinding techniques and results from a paper by Amos, Georgiou, Kayas, and Zendry, who prove that from a certain object they call a one-shot chameleon hash functions, you can construct all sorts of things like quantum money and budget signatures and things of that sort. Okay, so and as I mentioned, all of this generalizes to quantum commitments as well as to string commitments. Okay, so let me give a sketch of how we can prove this equivalence between sum and collapse binding. So this first implication is actually known from a work by Unruh, but our sort of contribution here is that we also extend this to quantum commitments. So what we do is we simulate the sum binding game until the adversary sends a commitment string C. And we can describe, the last message of the adversary as it applying some unitary to its internal state, and then measuring the opening register and sending out the outcome of that measurement. So what we do is we set this message register to be in the plus state. So instead of having a commitment to either 0 or 1, we set it to a superposition of the two. And then we apply a binary projective measurement that checks whether these messaging opening registers all map to C. So we can do this rather easily And if this check fails, then we just, output our guess randomly at the end. Okay, so in the collapsed binding experiment, the adversary has to send these two registers, so it sends them off. Now it receives these two registers again and wants to detect whether the message register was measured or not. So what it does is it uncomputes this unitary U and then measures the message register in the Hadamard basis. And if this measurement is plus, then it sends its guess as 1. If not, then it sends its guess as 0. Okay, so I won't work through like the details, but the main insight here is that in some events, our adversary will succeed with probability exactly a half, but this check done here in the middle succeeds with probability that's roughly the square of this sum binding advantage. And this implies that in the collapsed binding experiment, the adversary will succeed with probability also bounded away from a half. Okay, so this is one of the implications. The other implication has our, we simulate the collapsed binding experiment until the adversary sends not only the commitment, but the two registers. And then by assumption, we have some kind of binary projective measurement that that detects when this message register is measured. What we do is when the challenger asks the adversary to open to some bit B, then we measure the message register, and if we're lucky enough, then we get a message that's equal to this bit B. And in that case, we can just measure the opening register and send that off. The hard case is, the problem is we might open to a bit that's different from B. And in this case, we just try again. We apply this distinguishing measurement, then measure the opening register and send out the outcome. And we can show that, if this projective binary measurement detects a measurement to the message register with bias epsilon, then the adversary succeeds in the sum binding experiment with probability that's also like roughly, a half plus inverse poly as well, if the bias was inverse poly. Okay, so this is sort of like the first of our proofs. In the second, we note that like if an adversary breaks the sum binding condition with probability inverse polynomial probability, then it can open to either bit with some non-negligible probability, some inverse poly probability. What we'd like to do is to take a commitment scheme that doesn't satisfy the sum binding condition but does satisfy the computational binding condition, and then boost this opening probability to 1 minus negligible. And this is a notion that we call one-shot equivalent commitment schemes, which is sort of in the same flavor as the one-shot chameleon hash functions of Amos, George Kiais, and Sanders. Okay, so I'll try to give again like a quick proof sketch. How do we prove that if a commitment scheme is computationally binding but not sum binding, then we get this equivocal notion. So again, we simulate the sum binding game until the adversary sends a commitment. And then consider the projector that this adversary applies to its internal state when it tries to open to a bit B. So we have two projectors, pi 0 and pi 1, and we can use this notion of like basic quantum rewinding that basically says that if I'm running two computations and both of them succeed with high enough probability, then I can run them both in sequence and the internal state won't degrade as much, and we can get the same results with non-negligible probability. And at this point, we use these quantum singular value transformation algorithms that were exploited in this recent work of Lombardi, Ma, and Spooner. So we have two algorithms that we use here. One we call threshold that, in a sense, filters out eigenvectors of a certain projection, of a certain matrix that are below a threshold. We can rewrite this right-hand side as this matrix that the threshold filters out from. And we have a second algorithm that maps the image of one projector to the image of the other one. So at this point, we can assume, for example, that we've tried to open to 0 and succeeded. And what we can do now is, if we've tried to open to 0 and succeeded, then we can just reply with an opening to 0, if that's what we're asked for. But if we're asked for 1, then we can just apply this transform operation, send the image of pi 0 to the image of pi 1, and then, again, send an opening that succeeds with probability 1 in the case that this transform algorithm succeeds. And to remove this assumption, all we have to do is just try many keys. If we try a sufficiently large number of them, at least one of them will work with 1 minus actual probability, and all of this sort of works through. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop here, and I'm happy to ask any questions if anyone has them. Thank you.
Thank you. I will not attempt to communicate with people on Zoom. It didn't work well, but let's check if there are some questions on the chat. No questions. Okay, then let's thank the speaker again. And we have a break now. We'll reconvene in 25 minutes.
workshop is the tutorial talk by Alex Grillo. Alex is a CNRS researcher at the LIP6. He obtained his PhD at the Paris Diderot University, supervised by Professor Ioannis Kredenis. He was also a research fellow at the Simons Institute and a postdoc at the CWI and QSoft. He is working on many fields such as quantum computing, complexity theory, and cryptography. In cryptography, he presented fantastic results on secure merge quantum computation, zero knowledge for QMA, new proof techniques for post-quantum cryptography. Today, he is going to talk about information theory tools in quantum cryptography. So, Alex, can you hear me?
Oh, can I start my talk already? Okay. Can you see my slides? Yeah. I don't know. I have zero feedback. Okay. So, okay, sorry, I'm starting it now. So yeah, thanks for the organizers for inviting me here. And the idea is to give a tutorial on some information theory tools that are used in quantum cryptography. And the idea this will be a very, I don't know, broad and not so deep, but like the idea is to cover a bunch of topics to see which kind of results you can achieve. So to start, okay, let's remind us what happens when what happened with cryptography after quantum computing developed. On the one hand, we had that quantum would help malicious parties, so we cannot, for example, rely anymore on factoring or discrete log in order to create cryptography, because malicious parties with a quantum computer would be able to break it. But the good side is that we can now use quantum resources also to perform cryptography. So we can use like this, like a quantum communication, quantum computation, in order to create new or improved cryptographic primitives. And the goal of this talk is to focus on this second part and show a bit how can we use quantum resources in order to implement different cryptographic primitives. And this has using quantum states has been used like it's the beginning of quantum computing with when Wiesner proposed his quantum money scheme. Later, Bennett and Brassard, they proposed the quantum key distribution with information theoretical security. And since then, we have plenty of primitives that have been implemented in the setting. So we have, especially in the past 5-10 years, there are we see more and more protocols that use quantum resources in order to achieve sometimes unexpected primitives. And as I said, the goal of this tutorial is to present some underlying techniques that allow us to prove security of protocols that implement different primitives that I mentioned here. Let me now explain a bit more details my plan for today. so I'd like to focus on three primitives or three tools. One of them is sampling from a quantum population. Then I'll talk a bit about how to use error correcting codes in order to achieve protocols for different primitives. And finally, I'll finish with a bit with entropic inequalities and again applications to quantum cryptography. Having said that, so let me start with the first tool that I'd like to present. And the setting here, okay, before talking about sampling for a quantum population, let's give a step back and talk about sampling for a classical population. And the setting here, we have some unknown string x, and our goal is to estimate the Hamming weight of x with few queries. So the idea is that either we have to, you don't have access to the whole string, and then you can ask a few queries, but they're costly, so you cannot see the whole string. But still, we'd like to gather some information of it. In particular, we want to know more or less, like up to some precision, what's the Hamming weight of this unknown string. And there is a very simple algorithm to do that. You could just pick k positions out of this n bit string. You pick k positions I1 up to ik, uniformly at random, and you output. And here I'm computing the relative Hamming distance is just the sum of these positions, so the zeros and ones that I saw on these positions, and I divided by k, which is the number of queries that I made. And using tail bounds is not hard to see that if you have the error that you have by doing this sampling, like the probability that this error is is larger than delta is bounded exponentially in delta squared. So in particular, if delta is a constant fraction of x, then you have that delta could be, sorry, if k is a constant fraction, you can pick delta to be an inverse polynomial. So you have that you have a pretty good estimation, so an inverse poly estimation with exponentially small probability of being correct. Oh, sorry, of being wrong. So this should not be very hard for you. And in this tutorial, I'd like to focus on a specific case of this. I'd like to test if the string is the all zero strings, or if the Hamming weight of x is at least epsilon n. So the idea of, okay, you should see it, but the idea of how to use this Hamming weight is just to pick these positions, and if all of them are zero, then you say it's the all zero strings. Otherwise, I'll say that the Hamming weight is greater than epsilon n. And if one of these cases is true, then you should answer correctly with probability 1 minus negligible. Okay, after this, the tour to the classical setting, let's go to the quantum one. And the question that you want to answer now is if you can test if a given state psi is the all zero state, or if its Hamming weight is greater than epsilon n. But now we want that, again, to make just a few queries to the state. So for example, I can just read a few qubits of this quantum state, and I want to distinguish these two cases. And there are some subtleties that come in the quantum setting that are not, that don't appear in the classical setting. And the first one is that the measurements disturb the state. So even the statement that you want to achieve is not so clear because of these. Are talking about psi, or talking about the post-measurement state. Yeah, it could vary either way. The second difficulty, or the second subtlety, is that psi could be a superposition of, let's say, the all zero strings with amplitude almost 1, and with probability, or with amplitude very small, it is a string with Hamming weight that's bigger than the threshold. So in this case, should you accept this state? Should you reject the state? So this is not so clear from this question. So this question is too like it leave it ambiguous if this state should be accepted or not. So it should be more precise on what you're looking for. And finally, here, assume that psi is a pure state, but it could actually be entangled with something else. So we have a purification of this quantum state, and it's entangled. So what's the type of conclusions that we could achieve in this case? And then, this is exactly the question that Bauman and Fair studied in this paper published in 2010. And the setting that they achieve is the following. So the input to your test is some state psi AE, where A is the register that we're interested in, but E is the purification of the state, and we don't have access to it. It will be as big as we want, but we don't assume this state to be pure, like the register A to be pure, so we can keep this purification with environment E. And the goal, the goal of the test that they propose is that if we perform the test and the state passes the test, then when you look at register A, and specifically when you look at the post-measurement state of this test, so we do some tests, so it says that we do some measurements, and then you have some state psi prime AB or AE, I changed the letters. So you have this post-measurement state, and you want to know if the register A is close to the all zero states, or if it has if it has low Hamming wave. And the idea of how to make this mathematically precise is that we define some projector pi delta, where it has two parts, right? It has the part that acts on A, it has the part that attacks affects E, and the E part is identity. We don't have access to it, so we don't look at it. So we put a tensor identity in this register, but on the A part, it acts non-trivially. So we have this projector that projects onto the span over all strings with low Hamming wave. So you have all the strings I, Y that have a low Hamming wave, that Hamming wave smaller than delta n, and you consider this projector to be the projector onto the whole subspace spanned by those strings. And mathematically, this goal is that when you look at this state psi prime AE, when you apply this projection pi delta, it should, this is a typo, so it should be, 1 second. The probability that it projects into it should be bigger than 1 minus eta, where eta should be small. So the idea is that the post-measurement state, or the register A of the post-measurement state should project onto this subspace with a very high probability. And the test, the test that they propose, one of the tests that they propose is the same as the classical one. So you pick k positions at random, you measure the corresponding qubits of the register A, and you accept if all of the outcomes are zero. So this is the straightforward quantum analog of the previous test that we saw. And what they show is that if they pass the test, again, here there's this typo. So we have that the probability that the first register lies in this subspace is bigger than 1 minus the square root of the of this exponentially small probability, exponential small and delta squared. And not surprisingly, these the gap between the classical and quantum error is just a quadratic factor. And actually, the result that Bauman and Fair they prove is actually much stronger than this. They prove that if you have a classical tester that has some property, some error probability in the classical setting, the error probability of the analog test in the quantum setting would be quadratically worse. So this is the actual result that they show. But for the specific case that I'm considering here, this is the specific bound that they achieve. Okay, so this is the test that they propose, and let me now use it to prove the security of some primitives. So let me start with oblivious transfer. And let me just quickly explain what oblivious transfer is for those who don't know. So we consider, in the ideal functionality of OT, we consider two parties, Alice and Bob. And Alice, she is able to choose two messages, M0 and M1, while Bob chooses a bit B. And the idea functionality forwards the message MB to Bob, and only MB, not the other message. So it turns out that Bob will learn just the message that he chose, but Alice won't know what message was learned. So Alice has no information about B. And the goal is to, unfortunately, we don't have this idea functionality that computes this primitive for us. So we have to devise a protocol where Alice and Bob, they exchange messages. Alice has her two messages, Bob has his bit. And at the end of the protocol, Bob learns the message MB and nothing else. And Alice, in particular, does not learn B. So the goal is to implement protocols is to have protocols that implement this cryptographic primitive. And classically, it's well known which type of assumptions give or cannot give implementations of OT. So in particular, we know that public key encryption is sufficient for OT, and it's expected that it is also necessary. So there are no-go results for example, having classical protocols for OT using one-way functions. But still, of course, it's still open, but we expect that it's impossible. So we expect that public encryption is necessary for this. And it turns out that quantumly, we can do a bit better. So we can implement OT using bit commitments. I won't get into details on how to implement these bit commitments, and this is like it's very subtle, and there were a couple of results that finished these issues, I don't know, 1 or 2 years ago. But I'd like to present like the framework, the quantum framework for implementing bit commitment, for implementing oblivious transfer. And this framework was originally presented by Crépeau and Kilian, and it was later refined. And the idea here is that, again, you have the sender receiver. So the sender is Alice, the receiver is Bob. And the sender will pick some string and some basis, and will send the encoding of the string on that basis. So for example, if you have the plus basis, you have a bit, you just send that bit in the computational basis. But if you have some bit and the Hadamard basis, you send the plus or minus state. So it's just sending Wiesner type of quantum states. When the receiver gets this quantum state, they are supposed to choose a basis as well on their side, and to measure and have some outcome. So in some places these bases will match, some places that it won't. But we don't care for now. Actually, this is important for the protocol, and out of this measurement, this receiver will get this string x hat. And let's suppose for now that the receiver is forced to measure. So it received the quantum state, has no quantum memory, had to measure and get the string x hat. Later in the protocol, the sender will then just reveal their basis to the receiver. So it sends theta in the clear for the receiver, and the receiver can create two sets, the set IB, which are all the positions where the two bases match, and the set IB bar, where the bases are different. And the receiver splits these two sets and sends the sets I0 and I1 to the sender. And notice that the sender does not know which one is IB and which is IB bar. So it's just the two sets with two with disjoint positions over all of these lambda positions that were sent. Using some information theoretic encryptions, the sender can split the position of X on the positions defined by I0 and I1, and use these positions as keys to encode the message, or encrypt the message M0 and the message M1. And again, it encrypts the two ones using the part from I0 and the part from I1, and sends the two encryptions to the receiver, who is able to decrypt one of them, right? Because one, okay, in principle, the receiver knows exactly the string, the substring corresponding to IB, because the state was measured in the correct basis. So the receiver is able to decode that string, and it won't be that they won't be able to decode the other one because they had a random string as the output on those positions. So this would prevent the receiver to decode both messages. But there's a serious problem with this protocol, is that we forced the receiver to measure. So this is not true in general. So the receiver could have quantum memory and just wait for the bases and measure all of them in the right basis. And the solution for this is to use bit commitments. Up to now, we just had information theory tools, and now we had to use a bit of computational assumptions in order to really fix the protocol. So let me just quickly explain how to patch this protocol in order to make it secure. So the thing that we need here is something between like the first message and the second message, like the quantum message and the basis that the sender sent to the receiver. And the idea of the protocol will be the following. So remember that the receiver was supposed to choose this basis theta hat and measure it and have outcome x hat. The receiver, in this case, would then send the commitment of each one of these, the basis and each one of the measurement outcomes that they received. So we'd send the commitment I for all the theta hat I, x hat I. The sender will then pick a subset of all the lambda positions and tell the receiver open the commitments of the positions in T. And then the receiver answers back with all the openings of CY for all I's in T. And then the protocol continues by just ignoring the positions in T. So R will pick IB from the positions that matched outside of T, and IB bar will be the position that didn't match without T again. Okay, and the idea is that now, okay, this bit commitment somehow forced the intuition is that this bit commitment and this test is forcing the receiver to measure it. Let's try to analyze in a very hand-wavy and very, I don't know, shallow way the security of this protocol against malicious receiver. So in order to use the technique of quantum from sampling for quantum populations that I explained. So the first way, the first point in order to prove security is to tweak a little bit the protocol. And instead of the sender sending this Wisner-Manny type of state, like this basis in the computational basis or the Hadamard basis, we will tell the sender to send halves of VPR pairs. And later on in the protocol, it will measure these halves of VPR pairs in the random basis that they choose, and they get some string x. So these operations commute. They commute. So we're actually talking about the same protocol, but from a different perspective. And the idea of the proof is that if the sender, like if the test made by the sender on the positions on T, so it will check if when the sender received the openings of CI, it would, of course, they would check if when the positions match, the strings also match. And from the sampling from the quantum population technique, we have that if the test passed, then the whole state before measuring is exactly the right one that should be. So in a different way. So after measuring a few of them, the sender has a lot of guarantees on the state, on the positions that they didn't measure. And which is the guarantee is that it really it matches the quantum states that are corresponding to the commitment of R. So this test is telling us, okay, everything that we didn't open, like all the positions that we didn't open, they should be in the right state. And in this case, when asked to measure the APR halves, we know that this state has a lot of entropy from our from the malicious receiver's perspective. So these will give a lot of entropy to the string X from our perspective, and these will prove security. And using these, you can prove security of the protocol. So this is just a rough and hand-wavy sketch of the proof for this protocol, but it's just to give an idea of how one could use the technique that I presented in order to prove security in this setting. Is there any question? Okay, I don't think so. Okay, at least, yeah, nobody said anything. So I'd like also to, yeah, maybe quick present how one can use this to prove security of key agreement. So you might probably have seen it. So in key agreement, we have Alice and Bob that now want to help each other, and they want to share, they're trying together to have a common random key, but they are only talking on the phone. And they want to prevent that anyone who's eavesdropping their communication would be able to retrieve the same key as them. And of course, classical information theoretically secure key agreement is impossible because all the information that Alice and Bob are gaining, Eve could gain as well. So we need quantum communication for that. And there are plenty of protocols for quantum distribution. You might know a lot of them. I'll present one simple version of it, just again to say how this technique can be used for simple proofs of QKD. Like having full proofs of QKD might be very cumbersome, very complicated, but here, like using this technique, it gives a much simpler way of having a security proof of a non-optimal protocol. So of course, it's just a proof of principle. Like if you want optimality on the rates and everything, you need to use a fancier techniques. And the protocol that we consider is the following. So again, Alice creates CPR pairs and sends halves to Bob. Later on, she sends a random basis to Bob, and both of them will measure their APR halves on that basis. Then Alice sends, again, picks a random subset T of all the positions and sends to Bob, and Bob sends back the substring of Y corresponding to T. So, and Y is the outcome of Bob's measurement. Alice will check if her outcomes on the positions T match with Bob's one, and if not, she aborts. She will say someone else is dropping the quantum communication, or if the Hemingway or different ways, maybe not equality, but if the Hemingway of the XOR of these two strings is low, like if you want that the honest parties could also have noise, but I don't want to get into that details. If this test passes, then there are two steps that Alice and Bob can use to retrieve their key that will be secure. So the first one is that they can use a good error correcting code to correct any eventual error that X T bar and Y T bar might have. So as we see later, we have from the sampling from quantum population, we know that these two strings, they're almost close, but there might be some error. And the idea of this step is just how to retrieve from these errors. And finally, we use random extractors to distill a good key. So you have these two steps that I don't want to get into much details, but you have these two steps to finish the protocol, and Alice and Bob, they have a key at the end of it. So let me just sketch how can you prove, how can you prove security of this protocol of QKD using the techniques from Bauman and Fair. So first you can using these techniques, you have that if the two strings are the same, or if their Hamming weight, the Hamming weight of their XOR is small, then we know that the qubits in T bar, they are in the superposition with a lot of mass on low Hamming weight states. Okay, so it might be superposition, it might be not exactly the same, but they cannot be too different. So this is the intuition. So in particular, we have that as I said, the Hamming weight of the XOR of these two strings is low, like when after Alice and Bob measured these two parts. And on top of that, we can show that the entropy, in this case, the entropy of X on these positions is high for Eve. So these two properties, they imply two things. First of all, in the first case, it will tell us that the error conciliation part will work. So that step that I said, where Alice and Bob might correct some errors that they have on each side. And the second bullet, it tells that at the end of the day, the secret key that you extract is secure against Eve. Okay, of course, this is a very bird's eye view of the security proof, but using this technique, things go much smoother than previous proofs of for QKD. And with this, I'd like to finish this part for sampling from quantum populations. So I think that the technique is somewhat simple, but since I've learned this, I've seen this paper, I see that I can use it everywhere. So I think it's very powerful. So as I mentioned, there are proofs for obvious transfer, for key agreement, but it can also, it has other applications. For example, we have used it to test magic states and have for having protocols for two-party computation or multi-party computation. So yeah, I think there are plenty of contexts where this type of statement is very useful, and using these as a black box might make the analysis much easier. So with that, I'd like to finish this part of the talk on sampling from quantum populations, and maybe there is some question here. Okay, I don't think so. Okay, yeah. If there is any question at some point, please interrupt me. So now I'd like to switch gears and move to the second tool that can be used in quantum cryptography, which is our correcting codes. Let me again have a tour on the classical setting. So let me explain what classical error correcting codes are. And in this setting, we have Alice that she wants to send a message to Bob. So we want her to encode her message in a way that Bob will be able to retrieve the message back, even there are some errors that happen in this communication. So these errors could happen because of the channel is noisy, or for example, there's an adversary that flips some of the bits of the message. So we can consider both ways, but we don't. We won't distinguish them. So more concretely, when you're describing an error correcting code, we have two algorithms: the encoding and the decoding. And the encoding maps k bits to n bits, and the decoding maps n bits to k bits, where n should be greater than k, or sometimes much greater, but like the idea is that k is the message space and n is the ciphertext space. And the two properties that you want, of course, is that if you encode the message and you just decode it, then you retrieve your message back. So this is just to have correctness. But there are correcting parts that if you have two messages, then we want that the Hamming weight of the XOR of the encoding of M and the encoding of M prime, so this string has Hamming weight bigger than D, when D is called the distance of the code. And this means that if you have if you have this encoding and someone flips up to d over 2 minus 1 bits, then you can actually at least brute force for search which is the correct encoding that it comes from. Because like if you flip up to this number of bits, there's just one encoding that will be able to match this noisy encoding. And of course, okay, one goal is to have good error correcting codes, and in particular, you want to maximize the rate. So you want to maximize k over n, so the number of bits that you send and the size of a message that you want to send. And you also want to maximize d, meaning that you want to correct as many errors as possible. And for those who have never seen, classically there's a very trivial error correcting code. It's just by repeat a bit. So if you want to encode a bit b, you just repeat it n times. So it gives a turbo rate. So the rate of k over n will be 1 over n, but it has very good distance. The distance will be n over 2. So yeah, this is just to give like classically, just to give the feeling that classically at least trivial things can be done not so hard. Going to the quantum setting, it's just quantizing things. So now we have Alice that has a quantum message and she encodes it and sends to Bob. We wanted Bob to be able to retrieve the quantum state psi by even if there are a few errors on this quantum state. Being more precise, you have now that the encoding map k qubits to n qubits, and the decoding map back the n qubits to k qubits. Again, you want that if you encode some state psi and you decode this, and you just decode it, then you have psi back. And for the error, it's a bit more cumbersome, the notation, but it's the same idea. So the idea is if you have two states, psi 1 and psi 2, and I consider the encoding that here I'm denoting by phi 1 and phi 2. And the idea is that if I have some operator E that acts on at most d qubits, then you want that these two, that phi and E phi 1 inner product with E phi 2, this inner product to be equal to 0. So meaning that they are still orthogonal. So even if you apply an operator that acts on at most d qubits in one of these quantum states, in one of these encodings, it will still be orthogonal to the encoding of an orthogonal quantum state. And this allows us to be able to correct errors, and by brute force search, it might not be efficient, but at least in an information theoretic setting, the information is not lost. And again, our goal is to maximize the rate, so maximize k over n, and also maximize the distance. How many errors or how many malicious operations could have happened in the web. And unfortunately, quantum error correcting codes are not so simple as classical ones, so there are more things to check. But I don't want to get into details here how to construct this thing here. I'd like to focus on how to use it. But just keep in mind that there exist good quantum error correcting codes, and I don't know, the past years there have been several breakthroughs, and now we have even like LDPC, so codes that can even tested locally, and with a still linear rate and distance. So this is what I need from it. So just the definition of how to encode and detect errors, and the construction. I'll leave it for offline. I don't know. You can look for it later. And now that I have are there any questions on this? So if not, then I'll I'll dive into into applications. So the first one is authentication. So the idea is that, okay, the same thing. Alice wants to send a quantum state to Bob. And again, there might be some error or either adversarial or like, yeah, here we're mostly thinking about adversarially. So someone tampered with this quantum state. And what we wanted is that Bob will be able to output psi if the message was not tampered with, or to reject otherwise. So the idea is that here is we're not limited to like errors on a few qubits. So there is an arbitrary malicious party that is able to do whatever operation they want with this quantum state, and you still want that Bob will succeed in this task with very high probability. So if nothing happened or nothing, only the 9 things happen, then you have the state psi, or Bob will detect that the malicious party acted on it. Okay, so so the idea now is to present one of these authentication schemes, which is called the Pauli authentication scheme, or I'm calling it now. I think this is what usually people call. And for that, we assume that Alice and Bob, they share some previous information, so they share some common key. And the key that they share is contains the following operation. So sorry, the following values. So they share a basis theta, which on lambda positions. They share 3 strings A, B, and X with lambda, each one of lambda bits. And they also share a permutation pi on 2 lambda qubits. And Alice, to encode like this state psi on k qubits, she'll create the following state. She'll create the state phi, which is the encoding of psi using some error correcting code. So let's say the lambda is your security parameter. The idea is that lambda will be much larger than k. And then she encodes psi using this error correcting code that maps k qubits to lambda qubits, and the distance is d. And after that, using this shared key A and B, she just apply X, A, Z, B, which is the quantum one-time pad on this quantum state. And finally, she outputs the permutation of the state phi that she created with X on basis theta. So these are just Wiener-Mani type of states. So appended to this encoded and one-time padded state and permuted. So she puts these 2 states, permute them, and send to Bob. In order to decode and to verify the state, Bob will receive an arbitrary quantum state row on 2 lambda qubits, lambda from like the lambda that came from phi, and the lambda that came from x theta. And the first thing that Bob will do is to uncompute the permutation. So we just unpermute all the states, and this gives 2 registers: the register A, which is the one that contains information that should contain the information that Alice sent, and the register T that contains the traps, like that should contain these BB84 or these Wiener quantum mining type of states. And then Bob will perform 2 tests. In the first test, Bob will check if the register T contains exactly the state X on basis theta, and if it does not, Bob will reject. The second test that Bob will do is you check if row prime A, so the register A of the state row prime, it contains a correct code word. So we do like here I'm assuming that I didn't go into details, but let's say that you can decode and you can check errors of quantum arithmetic codes efficient. So Bob can check if row prime A contains a correct code word, and if it does not, Bob will reject. And if the 2 tests passed, then Bob will just apply the Bob does this into the one-time pad. So so the one-time pad should be before. Sorry about that. So the one-time pad should be here as well. And if passes, then Bob will just decode using this decoding algorithm from the hierarchy code of this of the register A, removing the one-time pad, and you output this quantum state. Yeah, again here I won't go into details of the security, but the idea of the proof is the following. So we have, let's say that you have an attack on the, so Alice sent the encoding of or the encryption of psi to Bob, and there is a malicious Eve that tries to tamper with the state. And using standard techniques, you can we say that okay, we can reduce these errors of Eve to Pauli errors, so we'll focus on Pauli errors, and this Pauli in Pauli operations. And these Pauli operations, they could have they could be heavy, so they could attack multiple qubits. And the idea is that okay, these heavy attacks would be carried by these trap states. But on the other hand, the attacks that Eve could do are just flipping a few, for example, flipping a few qubits of your quantum state, and then with some probability, or inverse polynomial probability, these traps wouldn't be able to catch this type of attack. But for that, we use the quantum error correcting code property. So we know that if you flip a few qubits of your quantum error correcting code, you're guaranteed to check it. So the quantum error correcting code here will prevent the attacks that are not checked by these trap states. So these are the properties, like there are detection properties that are useful in this quantum authentication scheme. And yeah, and this is what I wanted to talk about quantum authentication. Are there questions? So if not, I'll move on and talk a bit about secret sharing. So yeah, the idea of secret sharing is that you have a dealer and multiple parties, and the dealer has to share the quantum state row that she has to all of the parties. So she wants to have a way of encoding it and sending shares, like here sigma 1 up to sigma 8 to each one of the parties who hold them. And we want this sharing to have the following properties. If you have up to k parties that collude, and these k parties, with their even if they get together their shares, they're not able to retrieve the original quantum state row. But on the other hand, if k prime or more parties collude, so if you have more than k prime parties that come together, then these k prime parties can retrieve row. So usually pick k prime to be k plus 1, but here I'm giving some slack. So I want to put two parameters, k and k prime, but both are fine. So the secret sharing is, so the idea is that okay, yeah, you have a limited number of parties that won't be able to retrieve your original quantum message, so it's completely hidden. But if you give more, like if you more parties join, then at this point you'll be able to retrieve the secret. And actually, there's a very tight and I think elegant connection between quantum error correcting codes and quantum secret sharing. And this connection comes from the following observations, that if you can correct up to t errors for any t errors, then it turns out that the reduced density matrix of t qubits on each quantum error correcting code is independent of the logical state. So if I have the encoding, and if I have the encoding of psi, and I look to just a few qubits, up to t qubits, this should be the same density matrix of the encoding of phi for any phi. So it turns out that from properties of counter-arcing code, we must have these, and the proof of this statement, of a formal version of the statement, is similar to what the no-cloning theorem. Oops. How do I clear this? No. Can you still see my Zoom? Yeah, I think so. And the proof of this is similar to the to no cloning theorem. And this observation was used by Cleve, Gottesman, and Lowe to make this connection that actually quantum arcing codes are good enough quantum secret sharing schemes. And the idea is simply that the dealer computes the encoding of psi and give 1 qubit of the encoding, one qubit of the encoding to each of these parties. And it turns out that good codes will give good bounds on k and k prime. So again, yeah, I'd like just to give an overview, but this is the connection between like the fact that local parties up to T parties won't have any information about psi already gives like the secrecy part of their correcting codes, and the reconstruction part that there are that you can correct up more than T+1 errors, for example, then also gives how to reconstruct your quantum state. And it turns out that these properties, they are even maintained if we have local operations on quantum correcting codes. And this was used recently in these 2 papers to prove properties of quantum zero-knowledge protocols. So we use it to show with Slofster and UN, we show that MIP star is equal perfect zero-knowledge MIP star. So in other words, that all integral proof systems, they are equivalent to perfect zero-knowledge integral proof systems. And with broadband, we showed that the same technique can be used for proving that consistency of local density matrix is QMA complete. And in particular, there are very simple zero-knowledge protocols for QMA. And yeah, this finishes a bit what I'd like to talk about. Yeah, quantum arc correcting codes. Are there questions? Okay, so if not, I'll just quickly go through the last topic on entropic inequalities. And you know from quantum mechanics that there are measurements that are incompatible. You cannot, from a quantum system, you cannot fully measure its position momentum, or for example, if you have a qubit, you cannot jointly measure in the X and Z basis. And this, in particular, this gives, this can be quantified, and it gives us some entropic inequality. So the idea is that we can use these uncertainty relations, we can use this incompatibility of measurements to bound the entropy of measurement outcomes. And there are very different ways of measuring it, or sorry, of phrasing this type of argument, and I'll focus in one of them that was proposed by Thomas Michel and Renner. And the setup is the following. So imagine that Eve is able to prepare a tripartite state, rho ABE, and she gives the register A to Alice, the register B to Bob, and each of these registers has n qubits. And Bob will measure his register in the Hadamard basis and get a string Z prime. But Alice, so Bob does just this. He has no choice. He just measures in the Hadamard basis. But Alice will have some choice, and she'll choose either to measure her register in the computational basis and the outcome will be X, or she'll measure in the Hadamard basis and the outcome will be Z. And what Thomas Michel and Renner proved is that the entropy of X, like given E, like seeing X as a random variable, Z and Z prime as a random variable, and E is the purification of everything that Eve has, that the entropy of X to Eve plus the entropy of Z given Z prime should be greater than N. Here you have different types of, one of them is max. So I think this is max. So It's not vanilla entropy, it's about mean and max entropy, and it's a smooth version of it. I don't get into details on the definitions, but here the intuition is that if you have a strategy of Eve and you have that Z equals Z prime, then X has to have a lot of entropy for Eve. So if the entropy, if knowing Z prime, so if Z and Z prime are either equal or very close, then if Alice wants to measure her register on a computational basis, it will be impossible to guess it. Okay, so this is the takeaway message from their statement, and this was used recently in a protocol by Broadband and Islam to propose to implement a primitive called encryption certified deletion. And in this primitive, we have Alice that she has a message, and now she encrypts it and sends to Bob. And later on, in later phases of the protocol, she tells Bob, you have to erase the message that I sent. So Bob will have a quantum memory, he stored it, and when Alice says erase it, Bob has to erase the information that he had. And of course, if this is classical, this is impossible, right? You cannot force someone to forget something, right? Bob could just copy it somewhere else and in a different, I don't know, put on a cloud or something else. So it will be impossible for Alice to distinguish that. But with quantum resources, this might not be the case. So you cannot copy. So we can think of that this primitive is possible. And in particular, we want Bob to prove to Alice that he erased it. So he sent some string W that should convince Alice that he erased. So the security notion that we want is that, okay, after giving the proof, Bob won't be able to retrieve the original message. So Bob, like the message M, like Bob can never output M prime. Sorry, the output of Bob, if Bob tried to guess it, M prime, it should be different of M with very high probability or have high entropy. And actually, we want something much stronger, like just encryption should already give this, but we want to do this even if Alice, at the end, after Bob proved the deletion, that Alice sends the secret key that was used to encrypt the message. Okay. And as I said, this is an intrinsically quantum primitive. So let me again give just a quick overview of the protocol. And the idea here is that we have a permutation pi on 2 lambda qubits, and 2 random strings are 1 R2 and R3. And the encoding of will be like the message. So here E-enc is an error correcting code. You encode the message using some error correcting code. You XOR it using some hash function like R1, and you one-time pad it. And you append it to R3, where you apply Al-Hadamard. So this is a random plus and minus state. And so like these are the traps that are in the Hadamard basis, and your message is encoded in the computational basis. And everything is permuted. So Bob won't be able to distinguish which is the computational one or the Hadamard one. And the proof deletion will be that Bob will measure everything in the Hadamard basis and send a message to Alice, and Alice will check if the outcome measurement on the traps when you had the Hadamard basis. So the idea is that Alice will look at the positions where you had random plus and minuses, and she'll check if the positions, if the outcomes of the measurement on these positions are correct. And the intuition here again is that if the proof of deletion passes, then the computational measurement will have high entropy, and this comes from these entropic inequalities that I mentioned before. So the idea is you have to compose of a few of the arguments that I presented here in other protocols, but the fact that Bob won't be able to guess the message will come from the entropic inequality that I presented last slide. So just to summarize, here I try to give 3 rather general tools and present some cases where you can use it to have non-trivial quantum protocols. But actually, there are many more tools that could be used. For example, entropy accumulation, self-testing is something that's very useful for delegation of quantum computation, random generation, and so on. Twirling, which is like using one-time twirling, you can simplify attacks of quantum devices. So this is just a glimpse of techniques that are used in quantum cryptography. And with that, I'd like to thank for your attention.
Great tutorial, Alex. So, is there any question about his talk? No. So I have a quick question, Alex. So why do we need permutations in the protocol you mentioned, like Broadway and the Islam protocol? What's the role of permutation here?
If Bob knows which are the computational bases and what is the hardware basis, he can just copy the first one. So he knows where to cheat and where not to cheat. Right? Because here he would just measure, like if you don't have the permutation and Bob receives the state, when he needs to prove deletion, he just measures these in the correct basis and send random bits instead of the first string.
I see. Okay, thanks. Any other question? Okay, then let's thank the speaker again. Okay, so this is the end of this workshop. I'm not sure whether the second edition of this workshop we can have, but anyway, so in this growing field, there are many fantastic questions, so please join this field. I hope that many researchers join this field. Yeah, thank you so much.